This is the Thinking Mind podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're bringing you a lived experience episode with Kitty Wallace, who talks about her experience with Body Dysmorphic Disorder. But before that, we just have a quick announcement. You may have heard this on the last episode as well. The podcast will be shortly undergoing a rebranding. It's going to have a new name and a new logo. This is primarily a marketing decision, which was made with the team, including with our strategist Rosie, who's been working very hard behind the scenes to make the show as good as it can be. We're going to continue to be partnered with Maudsley Learning, who have been immensely helpful in making the show what it is so far, and will continue to help us make the show as good as it possibly can be. The show itself is essentially going to remain the same, although it will continue to evolve slowly over time, as it always has, but it's going to have a completely new look, so make sure you follow or subscribe on your podcast player to make sure you don't miss any new episodes. From April 14th, the show will officially be called the Thinking Mind podcast. As always, to new listeners, welcome. Here you can access in-depth conversations all about psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, self-development and related topics. To OG listeners, welcome back. And now here's today's episode with Kitty Wallace, all about Body Dysmorphic Disorder.
Today I have with me Kitty Wallace. Kitty, is it okay if I ask you to introduce yourself? As I'm sure you can do it better than I can.
I'm not sure about that, but I'll give it a go. So I'm Kitty. I am head of operations at the BDD Foundation, but I also have lived experience of BDD, and I became involved in the foundation specifically because, BDD has had such a massive impact on my life, and I wanted to try and give back and support others. And I just sort of fell into the role. So I feel very lucky about that.
Thanks, Kitty. Thanks for coming today. I think we should probably begin with your story and how it all started. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about your childhood and when you started to realise that you had BDD.
Yeah, it's tricky because I was always a really anxious child, always felt a bit different, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. I remember one time I must have been maybe about 6, and I was in the bathroom washing my hands with a friend before we were about to have supper. And I remember looking in the mirror and looking at me and looking at her. And it was the first time I can sort of remember my reflection and me making that comparison and feeling less than. But then, I was 6. It sort of went away for a bit. Other anxieties came to the fore. I've always had sleeping issues. But it was in my teens that the BDD started to creep back again. I needed glasses. I started to get a little bit of teenage acne. I mean, the glasses came before the acne, but I sort of felt different around the age of 12, 13. I was going into the bathrooms and break times at school and things like that, checking. I would be taking around a little mirror and some cover up. It was the early stages, but I think it was more normal then. And then I went to boarding school and it just started to ramp up. And I think, in my teenage years, there was a lot of focus on my appearance for various reasons, both at home and at school. I felt like I was letting everyone down. I wasn't how I should look. I wasn't how people wanted me to look. And I feel like my perfectionist tendencies in schoolwork is really simple. If you work hard, you tend to get good grades. So I made that decision. Well, I need to work hard on my looks. I need to improve here because that's where I'm really failing. I felt like I didn't have friends because of it. I was getting up really early in the morning, like 5:30 in the morning, and still sometimes not having time to have breakfast and being late for the first class in the morning and things like that. Every break time, rather than seeing my friends, because I was at boarding school, I could go up to my room and I would be taking off, reapplying. Also, I got an obsession with my hair at the same time. and also my nose. So I was constantly, washing and restyling my hair. I would have a really big fringe that would hide my nose. I only like to talk to people from a certain angle where I felt like my nose was covered by my hair. It was all consuming. And it's really weird to put my mind back to that time where it was just on my mind all the time. And I was living in a state of fear and anxiety. I don't know how I got through it now, looking back. But at the time, I felt like I had no choice. I just had to keep going. And yeah.
That's really horrible. Was it a particular area on your face? Or was it more that you wanted to look perfect? What was the rationale behind it?
So I think the perfectionism came in terms of in other aspects of my life by doing things as well as possible. I would avoid criticism, I would avoid judgment, and I would maybe get some praise. I think with my looks, it was certainly not the perfectionism was a weird thing. I felt that I looked so horrific, so dreadful, that I certainly wasn't seeking perfection. I was seeking normality. Okay. How can I just fit in? How can I blend in with everyone else? Because I felt like I stuck out like a sore thumb and that everyone was staring at me all the time.
That's so horrible to feel like that.
Yeah, but I think that, most people with BDD would recognize that feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was at school. I managed to get through school. I don't know quite how I did it. And I think it was possibly because I was at boarding school and there was no, unless I'd run away, but I was too scared to do that. There was no escape, and I was scared of the world anyway. So I didn't know what to do, but I made it through school. But as soon as I did that and I moved home, everything came crashing down and I just wasn't functioning. I was struggling to go out at all. I was struggling to do anything other than stay home. And that's when it became really obvious. Everyone knew that there was something going on beforehand, but no one had a name for it. And it was like, is this a teenage thing? Is this like just an issue with Kitty? Is this an eccentricity? I don't think no one said to me about mental health. I mean, mental health wasn't spoken about as much then anyway. But I just thought I was the only person in the world feeling like this, behaving like this. And it just compounded that feeling of you are totally alone and no one understands you. I didn't understand myself. And I just, to be honest, felt like an alien, in every sense. I go off on a ramble because my brain goes back there and I just, it brings back all of those thoughts and feelings and memories.
It's really interesting to hear you describe being in such distress, but actually not understanding what was even going on at the time. You said people didn't really know what was going on. Did people say to you, you're fine or you look fine? And when people said that, did it offer any reassurance whatsoever?
So, yes, of course I did get reassurance, but I think also when you've got BDD, the reassurance just doesn't penetrate. And your brain is also looking for loads of other evidence that you are this ugly thing that you see in the mirror. So I was collating family and friends saying nice things out the window, irrelevant to me. But if I could pick up on any other evidence that I was weird or ugly, that would be what my brain would listen to as, a bias for the negative.
Yeah.
But having said that, I desperately wanted reassurance in order to just try and step out of the house. So my family heard hundreds of times a day, sometimes, do I look okay? Do I look okay? Do I look okay? Sometimes it would be enough to get me to step out. Did it really make me feel less anxious? No. And I think then it became a need, for a long time. I have to hear that I look okay in order to do things.
At the time, did you feel like there was a way out, especially not knowing what was wrong with you? How did you see the future as this young girl, unable to leave the house?
Yeah, I think that's a really poignant question, because it's something I actually was chatting about with a friend not that long ago. I didn't see a future at all. Zero future. I said to my twin brother, will you please, have a room for me in your house? I'll live in your attic. I'll come out at night and I'll clean your house and I'll do what I can. But I didn't think that I would be able to leave the house. I didn't think I'd be able to support myself. I saw no future for myself at all. I remember people constantly saying to me, during those teen years, it's a phase. You'll grow out of it. It'll get better. Nothing irritated me more, to be honest, because I knew that not only was it not getting better, it was getting worse. And I didn't understand why. My obsessions were getting worse. My behaviors were becoming more extreme. The time I was taking to get ready was extending and extending. And I have people telling me it's a phase. I mean, it just so obviously wasn't, but I think that's what other people were holding out hope for.
And in terms of the getting ready, I think you mentioned you looked in the mirror, and I'm keen to hear you emphasize some people think, oh, these people are just vain, but you're not looking in the mirror to see something that you want to see. What are you doing when you're looking in the mirror?
So I didn't realize exactly what I was doing at the time. I needed therapy to kind of realize how I was looking in the mirror differently. But I was honing in on, I would start in one part of my face, really hone in and sort of move around almost in like a clockwise direction and try and solve my perceived problems in each little portion. I mean, my average time to get ready, and I say average because it could be far more, was, around this time that I'm thinking about, which is around the age of like 18, 19, it was around 4 hours. But there were times when I would spend 8 hours, that was probably my worst. And I ached all over.
Yeah.
My arms ached, my legs ached, everything ached because I'd just been standing up, hunched over. Obviously, this is a podcast, you can't see me, but I'm putting my hand really close to my face. But I was honing in and, just trying to pick up on every little problem with my face. And I couldn't solve it. I couldn't fix it. Sometimes I would be able to get the makeup to look okay enough for me to leave the house and try something. But even when I left the house, I was constantly looking out for other people looking at me. I was constantly checking in the mirror. If I was having a conversation with someone, I was watching their face to see if they were looking at certain aspects of my face. I was comparing myself with other people. Is their skin better? Is their nose better? It was, this chatter in my brain all the time that just took all joy from everything.
I think that's really important in that it literally latches onto every aspect of your life and it's just an absolute constant.
Yeah.
Did you have any capacity to think about anything else?
No, not really. And I would, I'd go to sleep at night and I would have nightmares about people seeing me without my makeup. I still sometimes do, but it's so rare now. And I think, oh, that's interesting. That's interesting that popped up again. But at the time, it was really common.
Yeah. Gosh, that's so horrible, especially as someone young. When we were younger, I'm not sure exactly how old you are, but mental health wasn't what it was today. We didn't speak about it. When you're 14, I didn't know what any of these things were.
No.
Not even anxiety or depression, let alone something like body dysmorphic disorder.
Absolutely. I mean, within my school, it was an all-girls school. There was knowledge on eating disorders, but even then it was a really difficult subject that people didn't understand. It was sort of shoved under the rug. Oh, that person's got something wrong. They've disappeared for a bit, but it wasn't an open discussion. And there was no discussion about how to support people, how to think about it, how to think about your own body image. And because I didn't fit into the eating disorder category, It was like, okay, no, I'm just the only person in the world who's like this. And this is actually because I do have physical flaws. I'm incredibly ugly. And I just have to live my life surviving this ugliness and trying not to upset people around me with my ugliness through all of these routines and behaviors.
That's so awful to think that that was how you were feeling for such a long time. It's a really horrible place to imagine that people are in. It's really upsetting. After you got home, after boarding school, what happened?
Yeah, so most of my friends went off on their gap years. That was really popular at the time. I'm not sure with the cost of living if they still are, and sort of all the problems in the world. They were a big thing at that point. I knew I couldn't go away. I mean, I could barely leave the house. And at that point, I didn't even know if I would be able to go to university. I just didn't think it was going to be feasible. I attended art school in London, but I was late every day and some days didn't go and really was struggling with it. And also feeling even more lonely and even more different because so many of my friends were doing all of these amazing things that I thought I would never be able to do. But the miracle happened, and I call it a miracle because for me it was. A family friend who knew what was going on with me, but again, didn't have a name for it, happened to watch a BBC documentary. It had Professor David Veal in it and had Rob Wilson. Actually, I think it might have just been Rob Wilson, but I just assumed that David's involved in everything. He watched this show and he messaged my brother and said, I know what's going on with Kitty. I know what's going on. Watch it. My family watched it separate to me. They didn't tell me about it. They just wanted to watch it and see what they thought. And they all were like, this is Kitty. But they were scared to tell me because of this fear of mental health. You know, is a diagnosis going to make her feel worse? Is it going to make her feel better? Is treatment possible? Is recovery possible? It was terrifying. At the end of the documentary, there was a link to the BDD Foundation, which at the time was just, I think it might have just been one web page or a couple of web pages. That's all it was. And my father emailed in and said, we think my daughter's got this. What do we do? Where do we go for help? Stu, who is still involved in the foundation, replied to him and said, go and get a consultation with David Veal. And my parents, well, I think it was my mother actually, who said to me, Kitty, we think we might know what's going on with you. Do you want to take a look at this page, which was the BDD Foundation web page, and see what you think? I looked at it and I get emotional even now because it was just like, oh my God, they're inside my head. This is me. And I thought I was the only person thinking, feeling, behaving like this. And suddenly I could put a name to it. And suddenly there was hope. You know, if you're struggling alone, there's no hope at all because I couldn't get myself out of it. And this was a chance to potentially get better or feel better or anything, any sense of relief I was running towards. And I was really lucky. We did a consultation with David. I think there was a waiting list, as there still is. But, you know, we got there. I was late, unsurprisingly. But he was very understanding about that because I think that's quite common.
Yeah.
And, you know, from that point on, I was lucky. I was able to get treatment with Rob Wilson. I was lucky that I was able to go down the private route. I was lucky that Rob had availability for clients. And my parents just didn't want to wait because they thought that if I didn't get the help then, it was, you know, I was getting significantly worse all the time. And again, I didn't know if I'd be able to go to university unless I had some help really quickly. That was the start of me moving towards not full recovery, but some recovery and being able to function so much better and some relief as well.
Yeah. I'm keen to talk about your therapy, but I'm just curious, at that time, what was the NHS route like for treatment for BDD?
Similar to the route today, apart from I don't think there were IAPT centres. I don't get the sense that IAPT actually is still quite up to par for BDD. I think it does need more specialist treatment and it needs longer term treatment. That's my opinion, but I think that is also the opinion of most specialists.
I think it's probably a bit of a postcode lottery. If you have a therapist that has experience with it, then you're lucky. I think lots of people just may have never treated anyone with BDD and IAP. Severe cases aren't common, and so people may not present services. And if you don't have experience, then they're only as good as the experience that they've got. Yeah, and you're right. Just to say, the waiting lists, even in the private sector currently now, are really long as well. There is still a lack of understanding within the system, and even in the NHS services. I mean, I worked at ADRU for 6 months. Most of the clients there for both BDD or OCD spent years having treatment from their local community teams, which wasn't specialist enough for their severity, their treatment, refractory BDD or OCD, and took years for them to find somewhere that actually could give them the treatment they needed. Anyway, we've gone on a little sidetrack.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's absolutely accurate. And I think it's such a shame and it's really sad. And I think that's why I feel like the foundation that I work for is just so important to give people some sort of a lifeline whilst waiting for this, much needed specialist care and support.
I think it's interesting as well when you mentioned what a relief it was to know that you weren't alone. And I've seen that in people when they come to ADRU, having someone else that understands what you're going through, because it can be quite a silent disease in that you don't want to talk about it because it inflicts so much shame in you and it can feel so lonely, I've seen from people. And so I think something like the BDD Foundation is so important. And I just hope that people know it's out there. And I worry that some people don't. I'm so glad you've come on the podcast, because I'm worried that there are so many people suffering that don't even know where to look.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I think, with BDD, the shame is compounded because you're so ashamed of how you look and you fear the judgment because of how you look. But then, you meet so many people who don't know what BDD is or don't understand it. And then you feel ashamed because no one understands you. You're ashamed of the mental health condition. You're ashamed of your behaviors. I mean, it's such a big ball of shame that you'll never, ever come out the other side. And that's where being in contact with people who have BDD, being in contact with services that genuinely understand it, really helps to reduce that feeling of shame because someone understands you.
I'm interested to hear in your own words, what is the treatment for BDD for those listening that have no idea how to treat this condition?
Yeah, so I had a specialised form of cognitive behavioural therapy with exposure response prevention. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I sort of highlight the specialised CBT is I think a lot of people will be offered more generalised CBT that's more focused for just anxiety or depression, whereas if you have a specialised version of, I think that's where it can really make the difference.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was a long time ago that I did a lot of this work, but I think in terms of the exposure, which is something that people tend to want to know about because it seems the scariest, and it is, but it also is really impactful. So we created, with my therapist, Rob, I created a bit of a ladder of things that were scary for me to do, from the least scary to the most scary. I can't remember what the most scary was that I wrote down, but I do remember my first exposure challenge that I did in therapy. I like to tell people about it because I think that someone with BDD will understand it. Someone who doesn't might be educated by it. I used to wear like I think it was 3 or 4 different types of mascara, and I would have to layer them in a particular way. And I felt if I didn't do that in that way, it would be really obvious and I would look worse. So my first step was just wear one less layer of mascara. That sounds to someone who doesn't understand BDD, well, that's pathetic. Come on, like anyone, that's not a scary thing to do. For me, it was petrifying. Yeah, I had all of these thoughts. Everyone's going to notice. It was more scary to leave the house. But I did it. And it was the first sign to me that actually I didn't have to listen to my brain telling me that I had to do these things. My anxiety about it did come down. And I was able to sort of build on that first step and just take really, really small steps in the right direction. And I think sometimes when you are about to start BDD treatment, the feeling is they're going to want me to go in there, take off all of my makeup, look disgusting, and it's going to be really terrifying and overwhelming, and I can't do it. I found that just doing the small steps were built up much quicker than I expected.
Were there times when you couldn't do something and you felt like a failure, but you still progressed in the end?
Yes.
I've met lots of people that have, setbacks, and I want people to know that that's not the end of the road.
Yeah, so I think that would actually move on to my, we're talking now about my first round of treatment when I was around 19. BDD recovery is up and down. It is tough. There are weeks that I couldn't do what I wanted to do, days when I felt like I'd regressed. I didn't want to leave my room. It's up and down. And I think that my perfectionist tendency was I'm going to be the perfect patient and I'm going to recover perfectly. And that's impossible. And I think another thing that I talk about is that in my late 20s, I did have a major relapse of my BDD. And I didn't leave the house for 5 or so months solidly.
Oh, gosh.
And for me, that was petrifying, to be honest, because I felt I've tried recovery. I've tried the treatment. I should be better. I should be fine. And I wasn't. And there were things that built up to it. It didn't just appear out of nowhere. There were signs that I ignored. There were things, I wasn't taking enough time for my own mental health and self-care. I wanted to ignore the BDD and go, that's in my past. I didn't want to look at it. But I did that to the extent that I wasn't noticing the signs that it was creeping back quite significantly. And I felt at the time that I felt the most hopeless at that time I felt throughout my journey, actually, because I was around 28. I had been working full time, but I had to step back from work. I initially took a sabbatical, but then I quit. I had been living independently. I moved back in with my parents. I just retreated from the world totally. And I didn't know how I was going to get out of it, to be honest. I didn't know. And, Rob was still my therapist. I got back in contact with him. But I think genuinely he probably didn't, you can't treat someone who isn't. I couldn't do the CBT for a bit, to be honest. I just didn't know where to start and I didn't have the motivation.
Mm-hmm.
But something that Rob told me, and I don't think he told me expecting it to have the impact that it did, but it did have the impact, was he told me about the high suicide rate with BDD and how the foundation at that point was receiving more funding from memorial fundraisers than anything else. Yeah. And we still get a huge percentage of our money, sadly, from memorial fundraisers. And it just floored me. There was me, in my family home, feeling incredibly sorry for myself. I was feeling there was a lot of self-pity about where I was at and how I was doing. And it suddenly kind of shook me out of that for a minute. And I thought, wow, I'm actually really lucky. I'm so lucky that I'm alive. I'm lucky that I'm being supported by my family, because that's something that, not everyone with BDD has. And I'm lucky that I've got a therapist, because again, that's not something that everyone with BDD has. And I thought, wow, I've got to give myself a kick up the bum. And I'm not sure if I can say that on the podcast, but that's how I felt.
I think that's fine.
And I was like, I've got to try again. I've got to try again. And so, started off with the first step again. The first step for me then was, I hadn't been out in so long. Where do you start? Leaving the house was petrifying. So I just sat in my parents' back garden in a place where I felt like no neighbours could see me. And I just sat on the back step. And that was my first exposure task the second time round.
Yeah. I just want to emphasize that going out to the garden for you, your parents' garden, that was exposure. And for most people going out to the garden, no one would think twice. And for you, that was absolutely petrifying.
Oh my gosh, it was absolutely petrifying, because you're not thinking straight.
Yeah.
With BDD, I felt like people could see blemishes on my face from a window that was, I'm not very good with distances, but it was a long way away. I felt like eyes would all be on me, even though they just weren't. But you have that feeling of being observed with BDD, and you feel that everyone can see your flaws no matter how far away they are.
Yeah.
Well, certainly I did anyway. And I started again from there. And I think when I started, I thought, I'm starting from scratch. But the truth was, I wasn't. The more you do CBT treatment or practice, it doesn't necessarily have to be guided by a therapist. There are things that I was taught in therapy that I still do now, that the practice, maintains me. But when I started repeating them again, they came back much quicker, and I think it's the neural pathways. I'm not scientific, so if I say the wrong thing, and I know that there might be clinicians listening to this, but the neural pathways were there for my first round of treatment, and I was just strengthening them, and I have to just continue strengthening them.
I was going to ask, did any medication help you at all?
So interestingly, I didn't go down the medication route until after my sort of second more intensive round of treatment. I don't know why I didn't. I think that it was a conversation that was had at the time, would this be helpful? But I was like, I just want to try the therapy and I want to see how I do. And I did quite well.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there were less conversations at the time about medication and the benefits and how it would be. And I think, I don't know what my real reasoning was, but I felt like I'm going to do this and I'm going to go down the therapy route and see how I do. The time when I did go on medication, it was after I'd done so much work with the CBT for the second time round. And I had made, again, huge progress. I was going out more, I was doing things, and I was sort of building my life back a little bit by little bit. But I just had this overwhelming generalized anxiety that I felt it wasn't on the BDD anymore, but it was sort of looking to latch on to other things. And I thought, why am I doing this to myself? I'm going to try the medication. I'm going to see how it goes. It was an interesting experience for me because it was the first time that I'd experienced life without overwhelming anxiety. And I didn't realize,
wow.
I didn't realize that you could live like that.
Oh my gosh.
I was like, wow, this is how other people are? What? They're just walking around without being racked by anxiety about every little thing. I could leave the house without feeling like something bad was going to happen. And it gave me a sort of baseline. So I can't remember how long I was on medication for. It was maybe a couple of years or so. And I was very slow to come off it. Very, very slow. I did then go back on it for a short period of time and then wean myself off it again. I think it's one of those things where everyone can respond slightly differently to medication. I did try some that didn't work for me. And it's about, if my personal experience, about finding the one that works for you and just being really sensible with it, actually, because the worst thing you can do is come off it quickly.
Definitely. Do you mind me asking which medication worked for you?
So I know people who have tried medications that didn't work for me and it was perfect for them. So I tried the standard fluoxetine. So it's SSRIs. I tried different SSRIs. Fluoxetine wasn't quite the right fit for me. Sertraline, again, not quite the right fit for me, but I know other people who've done really well on it. For me, it was citalopram that in the end seemed to be the right fit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is your relapse, and you said you're gradually getting better. Was it a gradual increase to where you are today, or did other things happen during that time?
I think the second time around, it's been more gradual. That doesn't mean that I haven't had bad days. That doesn't mean that I haven't had times when the BDD has been a bit more in charge than I would like it to be.
Yeah.
But it has been, I think, it has been a more gradual, a more consistent recovery. But I think there are different factors that have played into that. I think I'm a bit older, but mainly what's made the difference is being kinder to myself, being more gentle on myself, not beating myself up when I can't do something, but just being like, okay, I'll try again. I think with BDD, you live with this bully inside your head for so long, it becomes your norm.
Yeah.
And recognizing when I'm constantly telling myself bad things and being really hard on myself and trying to just be softer on myself, be a friend to myself. That was a new concept to me. I was like, I can be nice to myself. That's made a difference in my recovery. And I think people don't think that it will. I'll tell you what made me think differently about that was actually watching Professor Paul Gilbert at a BDD Foundation conference talking about compassion-focused therapy. You can find the video on the BDD Foundation YouTube or website. But that really had a profound impact on me and the way I spoke to myself. And I think also being in contact with other people who have BDD, because you hear them saying what you're saying to yourself.
Yeah.
You know, there's no way that you think that about them. And it starts to make you question this internal dialogue that you have towards yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I noticed working with people with BDD, which is quite different to people, tends to be different to people with OCD, is what we call insight. So people with body dysmorphic disorder tend to have no understanding that what they're seeing might be wrong. Whereas people with OCD know what they're doing isn't rational. But what's really upsetting is seeing people, I don't know if you agree, but seeing people that are obviously seeing something completely different in the mirror to what you see, and not being able to appreciate when they're really unwell, that there is another reality. They don't look like that. It's really, really upsetting. Does that make sense?
It does make perfect sense. And yeah, I have met, over the course of my time working at the foundation, I've met people, it's a spectrum BDD.
Yeah.
And with insight, again, it's a spectrum, but I have met people who it's really hard to get through. And
yeah,
I guess I try and focus on the behaviors associated rather than what they see in the mirror and the distress, because there are people living, I get nervous about saying this, but the truth is I think there are people out there living much more fulfilling and better quality lives who have got really, really distinctive disfigurements on their face, but they're managing to live with that and cope with that and enjoy life, whereas someone with BDD is so defined by what they perceive their appearance to be and the anxiety. So I think, I'll try to focus on what the behaviors that you're doing, the anxiety that you're feeling. Is that fair? And would you if you saw someone else on the street who you felt had something obviously different about their appearance, would you, expect them to live like that? Or do you think that they deserve to live a good quality life and a happy life regardless of their appearance? Then you've got the thing, well, that's them, not me. And it can become a battle. There's no easy solution because you believe what you see. That's human nature. I look in the mirror and I still see some of the aspects of myself that I hated. I just have a slightly different relationship to what I see in the mirror. And I'm able, before I would just see exactly what I saw. Through treatment and through getting some distance from that, I can almost flick what I'm seeing in the mirror. I can almost have my BDD view, or my sort of more normal, for want of a better word, view of myself. I have no idea what I look like. And I don't think I ever will. I can't get that certainty, and I have to live with the uncertainty. I don't know how I look. I don't know how others perceive me to look. But I think the truth is everyone looks at everyone differently.
Yeah.
So I think it's also about living with the uncertainty. And if you can get to a point where you can accept there could be some uncertainty, because I think initially it's like, this is how I look and nothing is going to convince me otherwise. The only other thing that I sort of feel is that when you're at that point where you are so unwell and life is so difficult and there's nothing to hope for, the only thing you can do is try and engage in treatment.
Yeah.
Because what's the alternative? You might as well give it a go.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I said to myself the first time round. I mean, the second time around, it was a whole different sort of thing going on in my head. But the first time around, it was, this may not work. I didn't think it would. There was part of me that felt that it wouldn't, because I didn't quite see how I could ever feel differently about my appearance. But what other choice did I have? It was either that or be housebound. It was either that or not have a life. So I just thought, I'll try.
Yeah. I just want to emphasize as well what you're explaining. I'm conscious we don't have much time left, but you were living a life where your thoughts were constantly revolving around your appearance. You couldn't leave the house. Going into your garden was petrifying. And I want to emphasize that because I'm conscious from what I see on social media that the public's understanding of BDD is not what we see in mental health services. And I am aware there's a spectrum of severity of BDD. But something that I'm really conscious of is what people understand is BDD and what is not BDD. And I wanted to hear in your own words how you would explain it from someone that's actually suffered with it.
Gosh, how would I explain it? Whenever I'm asked that question, I tend to go to the sort of clinical diagnosis, but that's not what you're asking me. I think the phrase that irritates me the most is everyone's got a bit of BDD. No, they don't.
No, they don't.
They absolutely do not. I think most humans have got some amount of body dissatisfaction where they've got an aspect of their appearance that they're not super happy with, but it doesn't actually impact their quality of life.
Yeah.
BDD is all consuming.
Yeah.
It sucks the joy out of life and it impacts every aspect of life.
Yeah.
And I think that overwhelmingness is only someone with BDD can truly relate to.
Yeah.
I don't know if that explains it.
No, I think that's perfect. I'm just emphasizing, like you said, that it really does. It's like a disease. It is a disease that crawls in. It's like a virus that crawls into every aspect of your life to the point where you no longer can think of anything else.
Absolutely.
People deserve to live, deserve to have a good quality of life. And it's so upsetting to think that people out there aren't having that life that they deserve to live.
Yeah.
And you did touch on suicide rates. And I don't know if we know the exact suicide rates of BDD because I think it's difficult to know exactly how many people are suffering with BDD. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, so I think The stat that I tend to quote is that it's 45 times higher than the general population. But it's really interesting. I think that it could be higher because I'll see articles in the press. There are a couple that stood out to me that were about a focus on hair. The headline was, "Woman kills herself because of a bad haircut." This was only a couple of years ago that I read this, and nowhere in that article did it mention BDD. It was so obvious that that was what was going on. And when suicides are recorded, it's often not recorded alongside it. I don't think that person died by suicide. I think they died as a result of BDD. You're right, it's not accurate. That's why more support needs to be given, and it's not something to be taken lightly.
No, it's really, really not. It's such a debilitating illness, and it's an illness that you really can't see. Physical health illnesses you tend to be able to see more than mental health, and some mental health illnesses you tend to be able to see more than others, and this is one of them that is really, really silent because people don't leave the house. I've seen lots of people that have really struggled with COVID, and I feel like people with anxiety disorders were ignored during COVID ultimately, especially OCD and BDD, and it's something that's I'm really passionate about and it's really upset me. Have you seen people relapse during COVID?
COVID was awful. COVID was absolutely shockingly awful for anyone with an anxiety disorder. Our website just exploded with people getting in contact. We expanded our support groups to weekly. We then got funding for an email helpline. As a result, our support services expanded, but in terms of the wider support out there, there was not enough. And I think we are still seeing the repercussions. And I think that there still needs to be more done because the focus was so much on physical health during that time, which is understandable. But those with mental health conditions were absolutely sidelined and their needs were put to the bottom of the pile. So yes, some lives may have been saved in terms of physical health, but I am certain that many lives were lost as a result of mental health.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like you said, the treatment for BDD is exposure and then response prevention. And you go 2 years without leaving the house and it being normal during COVID. It makes sense how people have got so much worse.
Yeah, absolutely. But we just need to keep moving forward and hope that more people access the right help, and just simply understanding that it's not their fault, that things might have got worse during that time and that things can get better again.
Do you want to say a little bit about the BDD Foundation before we finish?
Yes, I can try. BDD no longer consumes my thoughts. The foundation does, because I care so much about it. We're still a really small charity, but most of the people involved in it have lived experience of BDD or of caring for someone who has BDD. And we've also got clinicians, specialist clinicians as well on our trustee board. We've obviously got our website that's got loads of resources, videos. We've got our Beating BDD podcast. So we've got our own podcast that you can listen to and you can hear people talk about their experiences with the condition. We have, I mentioned earlier, we've got an email helpline. One day I'd love to have a phone helpline, but we're not there yet. But our trained volunteers can get back to you with information on the condition and treatment options and how to access them. We have support groups. We also have our Overcoming BDD programme, which was devised by Professor David Veal and Dr. Rob Wilson, which is a 20-week programme online taking you through specialised CBT for BDD, but it's more of a peer support, structured support group, if that makes sense. There are facilitators, but they're not professionals. They have lived experience of BDD and have been through treatment themselves. I'm sure there's so much more I could say, but I think all I would say, take a look and say hello and make contact.
Yeah, we'll put a link below under the description when we upload the podcast. Is there anything else that you'd like to say?
One more thing. Yes, one more thing. This is hot off the press, but save the date for the 4th of November, because we're going to have our next conference on that date, and it will be in central London in person. Although there will be an option, if you aren't able to attend in person, there will be a live streaming option, but we would love to see you there.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, thank you so much.
This is the Thinking Mind podcast.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, we'd love it if you share it with a friend, or you can give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you fancy it, you can even buy us a coffee to support the team, and the links for that will be in the show notes. Thanks for listening.